All right, today, lesson 3C, simple interest. As I mentioned earlier, this is the last of all of the ratio and proportion topics, and then we'll spend a few days after today getting ready for our next test, which will include up through this stuff. So percent of error, percent of change, all of that markup, discount, sales tax, tip, new price, all of that stuff. But today our focus is on something that we call simple interest. So let's go ahead and get started. If someone borrows money from a bank, what factors influence how much is paid back? So all of you, when you get older, at some point in your life, you're going to probably have a credit card, or you're going to have to take out money from a bank to buy a car, or perhaps to buy a house. When you do that, you're going to have to borrow money from a bank. And so there are some important factors that influence how much you're going to have to pay back to the bank. So for example, let's say you borrow $20,000 to buy a car. You're going to have to pay back to the bank more than $20,000. They're going to charge you money for letting you borrow the $20,000 to borrow the car. It's based on how long the loan is, and it's based on whatever percent interest it is that you have to pay. So, first of all, the principal. And I believe at some point there's some things you need to fill in here. But principal is basically how much you're borrowing. Or, on the other end of that spectrum, at some point, if you don't already have a savings account, the bank will pay you for you putting money in the bank, because what they do is they take your money and then they reinvest it. So, there's two ways to look at principal. Either how much money you're borrowing from a bank, or how much money you have in an account, like a savings account. So that's why when I say or deposited, that's what I'm talking about. As I mentioned earlier, the amount of time that you borrow the money in years, and also the interest rate that the bank is charging you. And we usually call that the annual percentage rate. So it is these three things: how much you're borrowing, how much time you're borrowing it for, and what the interest rate is. And when we put all of those things together, we have something called simple interest. And to find the amount of simple interest, and this is where you start writing stuff down, it is very simple. It is the principal multiplied by the interest rate multiplied by the time. And we usually shorten that up to look like this. I equals P times R times T. I comes from simple interest. P comes from the principal. R comes from the rate. And T comes from the time right there. I equals P times R times T. Or interest equals principal times the rate times the time. And one other important piece of information: simple interest is money paid only on the principal, because we do have different types of interest that we may earn or that we have to pay back. So simple interest is money paid only on the principal. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. Number one, Joe borrows $200 from the bank at 6% simple interest for 3 years. How much interest does he owe? Well, that's where the simple interest formula comes from. Now, the only other thing we have to pay attention to, and this is where you should start writing stuff down, is that when we calculate the interest, we need to use the percent as a decimal, which we've done in other problems over the last couple of weeks. So P is 200. Why is it 200? Because $200 is the amount that Joe is borrowing. So therefore, it is the principal. The interest rate that he has to pay is 6%. But the first thing that we need to do here is we need to turn that into a decimal. And remember, 6% as a decimal is 0.06. And how much time did he borrow the money for?
3 years.
3 years. So T is 3. So we need the principal, which is 200. We need the amount, or the percent interest, which we have to quickly turn that into a decimal. And that's the most common mistake. Some people forget to turn the percent into a decimal, and then we take the time, and to find the amount of interest, we multiply those values together. Now, before anybody does that, I want you to listen very carefully. We have one number times another number times another number. You have two choices here. You could just go left to right, which is what most of you would do if I didn't say anything to you. But on these type of problems, since there's a decimal in the middle, we could use the commutative property and multiply numbers out of order because it's just straight multiplication. And the reason why you would want to do that, and here's the important piece, if you don't do that, you're going to end up multiplying by a decimal once, and then most of the time you're going to get a decimal value, and then you're going to have to multiply by that decimal value again to multiply by the amount of time. So that means you end up multiplying by a decimal twice most of the time. My point is that if you use the commutative property, you won't have to do that. So here's what I'm saying. Let's rearrange the numbers to make it a little easier for us. And this is using the commutative property. And the reason is because most of the time we can multiply these first two numbers in our head. By the way, what is 200 times 3?
600.
See, so you just did one multiplication in your head. So now we basically have, and I'm out of room down here, so now we basically have 600 times 0.06. So we only had to multiply by a decimal one time. So I'm going to let you finish that, and that will give you the amount of interest that Joe owes. So like I mentioned earlier, when you borrow money from a bank, you don't just pay them back, in this case, $200. You have to pay them back $200 plus the amount of interest that they charge you. So in this problem, you are having to pay $36. Now the second part of this question is this. How much total does he owe now? Well, he's going to owe the $200 plus the $36 worth of interest that they just charged him. And so that second part of the problem is going to be $236. So Joe is going to have to pay the bank back $236. $200 that he borrowed plus the $36 worth of interest. Any questions on this problem? So number 2, Juan invests $5,000 in bonds for 6 years at an annual interest rate of 7%. Two parts, much like number 1. How much interest did he earn? So this time, somebody is letting the bank borrow their money, but it works exactly the same way. The amount of interest that they paid him, or that he earned, comes from the principal, how much money he invested, times the interest rate as a decimal, times the amount of time that he put the money in the bond for, which happens to be 6 years. And one thing that's taking some of you too long is you did not listen when I suggested that you use the commutative property to multiply these two numbers together first, because it makes it a lot easier. And you can do that because the commutative property says if all we are is adding or multiplying, we can multiply or add out of order. 5,000 times 6 is 30,000. And we're going to multiply that now by the decimal value. And the reason why we do that is so that we only have to multiply by a decimal one time. And 30,000 times 0.07 is $2,100. So that means that Juan earned $2,100 worth of interest. How much is the bond now worth? Well, you add the $2,100 onto the $5,000. And so now that bond, which was worth $5,000 6 years ago, it's now worth $7,100. Questions? In both number 3 and number 4, we're finding the simple interest, and then we're also finding the total of the principal plus the interest. In other words, the amount of money that was put into the bank or the amount of money that was borrowed plus the interest. So for number 3, the principal is 900. The interest rate as a decimal is 0.03. The amount of time is 5 years. If we find the product of all three of those, and of course you could go left to right if you wanted to, but for me, I would multiply the 900 times the 5, which is 4,500. And then I only have to multiply by a decimal value one time. So the amount of simple interest is $135, but we are also asked to find the total of the principal plus that. So we add that on to 900, and that means the total of the principal plus the interest is $1,035. Same thing in number 4. $1,400 at 2% interest for 18 years. Our principal is $1,400. Our interest rate as a decimal is 0.02. And our time is 18 years. When we find the product of those three values, and once again, you may go left to right if you want to, but I would multiply 1,400 times 18 first. But regardless of how you did it, the amount of interest is $504, and then we have to add that back on to the $1,400, so that means it's now worth $1,904. Any questions about 3 or 4? All right, let's do the same thing. Let's do number 5 and number 6. Number 5 and number 6, you're going to have to pay a little more attention to what you're reading. So let's do 5 and 6, and then we will compare both with our shoulder partner. All right, number 5. Grace borrowed $3,500 to be repaid after 5 years at an annual simple interest rate of 8%. How much interest? So in this problem, we are only being asked to find the amount of interest. So 3,500 times 0.08, multiply that by 5, and we would get $1,400 worth of interest. That's all we're asked to find. And number 6, Paige deposited $1,500 in a savings account. How much will she have in the account after 3 years at an annual simple interest rate of 4%. This time we're asked how much you'll have in the account. So that will be the interest plus the $1,500. So the amount of interest that the bank paid her was $180. So she now has $1,500 plus that $180 in the account. So that would be $1,680. Any questions? All right, we are finished.